Greetings, sir.
Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?
No, officer. Could you please tell me the reason?
What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?
Action, the blue lights flashing in the rearview mirror didn't make sense, but it was the sudden dead silence in the car that warned Marcus. This wasn't going to be a simple traffic stop. In a neighborhood where the driveways are longer than most city blocks and the streetlights cast long, quiet shadows, being in the wrong place at the wrong time isn't just a mistake, it is a profound liability. The air inside the rented Mercedes sedan was comfortably cool. The climate control humming a low, steady rhythm that had lulled David into a light sleep in the passenger seat. It was 8:45 p.m. on a Tuesday in late October. The setting was Oak Creek Estates à Hyperaffluent, heavily manicured suburban enclave about 40 minutes outside of Philadelphia. The kind of neighborhood where the roads wind gracefully past sprawling stone manors set far back behind ancient, sprawling oak trees and wrought iron gates. There were no sidewalks here, only perfectly edged lawns that met the dark asphalt seamlessly. At 34, Marcus Thorne was a man who lived his life by the details. As a senior architect at a boutique Chicago firm, his days were measured in millimeters. Structural loads and precise angles. Tonight, he was wearing a tailored charcoal suit, the jacket resting neatly in the back seat, his crisp white dress shirt rolled meticulously to the forearms. He had a nervous habit of rubbing his right thumb against his index finger when he was thinking, a silent tell that he was currently employing as he navigated the winding, unfamiliar roads. In the passenger seat, his business partner, 36-year-old David Lin, a pragmatist and brilliant structural engineer, was exhausted. They had flown in 3 hours earlier, grabbed the rental, and driven straight out here to scout a 2-acre vacant lot their firm had just been contracted to develop for a high-profile client. They were professionals doing their jobs. But to the resident walking her golden retriever 3 blocks back, they were an anomaly. A dark, slow-moving vehicle with out-of-state plates, circling a cul-de-sac and pausing in front of empty lots in the dark. In Oak Creek, anomalies were not tolerated. The 911 call had been brief, vague, and entirely based on a feeling. The caller reported a suspicious vehicle casing the neighborhood, driven by people who, in her words, simply didn't look like they belonged there. That call fell to Officer Greg Vance. Vance was a veteran of the local police department, 18 years on the job. He was a man who prided himself on his instincts. Over nearly 2 decades, he had developed a deep-seated belief in his own gut feelings, a reliance on the unspoken intuition that told him when a situation was off. But the danger of relying entirely on instinct is that instinct is heavily informed by bias, and Vance had spent his entire career policing a specific demographic in a specific way. To him, 2 minority men in suits driving slowly through Oak Creek in a dark rental car at 9 o'clock at night didn't compute as architects scouting a site. It computed as an elaborate front. When the red and blue lights shattered the darkness of the suburban street, Marcus didn't panic, but his stomach tightened. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his thumb pressing hard into his index finger. He signaled carefully, pulling the Mercedes smoothly to the shoulder, the gravel crunching loudly beneath the heavy tires. He shifted the car into park, turned off the engine, and immediately reached up to switch on the interior dome light. He placed both hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. Beside him, David stirred, blinking against the sudden brightness, his confusion quickly morphing into a quiet, resigned alertness as he registered the flashing lights painting the oak trees outside. Footsteps approached. They were heavy, measured. The sound of thick leather boots on asphalt. The beam of a heavy tactical flashlight pierced the driver's side window, sweeping across Marcus's face, darting over to David, illuminating the iPad resting on David's lap, and finally settling on Marcus's hands on the wheel. The dialogue that followed was painfully polite. yet heavily loaded. It was the kind of conversation where the words spoken were far less important than the subtext beneath them. Officer Vance asked for license and registration, his tone flat, carrying the practice authority of a man entirely in control of the physical space. Marcus kept his hands visible, calmly stating that he was reaching for his wallet in his back pocket and then into the glove compartment for the rental agreement. When Vance asked the inevitable question what brought them to this neighborhood tonight, Marcus answered plainly. He explained they were architects from Chicago, scouting the vacant lot on Birchwood Lane for a client. He kept his voice steady, avoiding any sudden shifts in pitch or tone. He offered the business cards in his wallet. Beside him, David held up the iPad, the screen glowing with complex topographical maps and site blueprints. It was a perfectly reasonable, entirely verifiable explanation. But Vance, standing in the cold night air, holding Marcus's Illinois driver's license, did not see two professionals. His subtle, unconscious biases filtered the reality in front of him. He saw a rehearsed story. He saw a prop in the form of an iPad. He saw an excuse, Vance informed them, almost as an afterthought, that he had pulled him over because Marcus had briefly crossed the double yellow line while taking the last curve. It was a pretextual stop in American law under a Supreme Court case called Wen v. United States. Police officers are legally permitted to use a minor traffic violation as a pretext to pull a vehicle over, even if their actual motivation is to investigate a separate, unsubstantiated suspicion. Marcus knew he hadn't crossed the line, but he also knew that arguing on the side of a dark road was a losing battle. He simply nodded, apologizing for the supposed infraction. Vance took their identification and the rental agreement back to his cruiser. The ensuing silence in the Mercedes was thick and heavy. The ambient noise of the crickets outside seemed deafening. David let out a long, slow breath, muttering softly about how they should have just waited until morning. Marcus didn't respond. He kept his hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead, the knot in his jaw tightening. He was a successful man, highly educated, respected in his field. Yet in this specific moment, stripped of his context and reduced to a profile, he felt entirely powerless. 10 minutes passed, then 15. This is where the tension slowly shifted into a legal gray area. Under the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, a traffic stop must be temporary and last no longer than is necessary to effectuate the purpose of the stop. The officer can check the driver's license, determine if there are outstanding warrants, and inspect the vehicle's registration and proof of insurance. Once those tasks are completed, the stop must end. Unless the officer has developed independent, reasonable suspicion of another crime. At the 20-minute mark, Vance returned. He did not have a ticket book in his hand. He did not hand back their licenses. Instead, his flashlight swept the interior of the car once more. He asked Marcus to step out of the vehicle. The request hung in the air. The Supreme Court in Pennsylvania v. Mims established that officers can order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop for officer safety, but context is everything. Out on the dark road, illuminated only by the cruiser's headlights. Marcus stepped out, the crisp autumn air cutting through his suit shirt. Vance directed him to the rear of the Mercedes. Vance's demeanor had shifted from restrained inquiry to active investigation. He began asking a rapid-fire series of questions. Where did you fly into? What airline? Who is the client? Are there any weapons in the car? Any large amounts of currency? Any narcotics? The questions were designed to disorient, to catch Marcus in a lie. Marcus, maintaining his composure, answered each one calmly, repeating the same truthful information. Vance then approached the passenger side and separated David, questioning him independently, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. There were none. Despite having no conflicting statements, no physical evidence of a crime, and no legitimate reason to doubt their identities, Vance's gut refused to let it go. He returned to Marcus and made a request that crossed the line from a routine stop into a constitutional violation. He asked for consent to search the vehicle. Marcus, fully aware of his rights, politely but firmly declined. He stated that they had a long flight, they were tired, and they simply wanted to get to their hotel. He did not consent to a search. This is the pivot point where the procedural error crystallized. Denied consent. Vance should have issued a citation or a warning for the alleged traffic violation and let them go. Instead, frustrated by the refusal and anchored entirely to his unsubstantiated bias, Vance radioed for a K-9 unit to conduct an open-air sniff of the vehicle. He informed Marcus that they were not free to leave until the dog arrived. The wait was agonizing. Another 25 minutes ticked by on the dashboard clock. The two men stood on the side of the road, the flashing lights drawing the attention of the occasional passing resident, branding them with a stigma of guilt in the eyes of the affluent neighborhood. The psychological toll of being detained on the side of the road, treated as a criminal suspect while doing absolutely nothing wrong, is a quiet violence. It strips away dignity, layer by layer, minute by minute. Marcus felt a cold, deep anger settling into his chest, an anger he forced himself to completely suppress behind a mask of calm cooperation. When the K-9 unit finally arrived, the handler walked a Belgian Malinois around the perimeter of the Mercedes. The dog sniffed the doors, the trunk, the wheel wells. It did not alert. There were no drugs. There was no contraband. There was nothing but architectural samples, measuring tape, and luggage. Faced with a complete lack of evidence, the facade of the investigation crumbled. Over an hour after the initial flashing lights, Vance finally handed back their IDs. He did not issue a citation. He merely gave a verbal warning to watch the center lines and told them they were free to go. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of the massive disruption. Vance simply walked back to his cruiser, leaving Marcus and David standing in the cold. When they finally arrived at their hotel, neither man spoke for a long time. The silence was different now. It was heavy with the shared, unspoken reality of what they had just endured. But Marcus was not a man who let things simply wash over him. His meticulous nature, the very trait that made him a brilliant architect, demanded structure. It demanded accountability. The next morning, Marcus contacted a prominent civil rights attorney in Philadelphia. The initial consultation was sobering. The attorney explained that cases of racial profiling and unlawful detention are notoriously difficult to prove. They often devolve into a he said, she said scenario where the courts heavily favor the subjective judgment of law enforcement officers acting under qualified immunity, unless there was concrete proof that the stop was unreasonably prolonged without independent, reasonable suspicion. They had no case. This is where the twist slowly revealed itself, rooted not in a dramatic coincidence, but in an overlooked piece of modern technology. Marcus's rental was not just a standard sedan. It was a high-end trim of the Mercedes S-Class, equipped with a comprehensive, integrated 360-degree dashcam and cabin surveillance system. It was designed for liability in high-end rentals, recording video and crisp, sensitive audio to a secure internal drive the moment the ignition was turned on, and continuing to record ambient audio for up to an hour after the car was turned off to capture potential vandalism. When Marcus's legal team subpoenaed the records and downloaded the vehicle's data, they found a goldmine of indisputable evidence. The camera footage clearly showed the vehicle's position on the road, proving unequivocally that Marcus had never crossed the double yellow line. The pretextual stop was built on a documented falsehood, but more damning was the audio because the system continued recording. It captured the exact timeline of the detention. It captured the crisp, polite explanations Marcus and David had offered. And crucially, it captured the ambient audio of Officer Vance speaking to the K-9 handler when they were standing near the hood of the Mercedes. The microphone picked up Vance's voice, unguarded and candid. In the recording, The handler asked what they were dealing with. Vance laughed softly, a dry, cynical sound, and replied, a couple of guys from the city claiming to be architects, "Soudn't I? The whole 9 yards. I don't buy a word of it. They don't belong out here. Let's run the dog and see what shakes loose." That single recording destroyed the defense. It proved that Vance had no reasonable, articulable suspicion of a crime. He had a hunch based entirely on the fact that they didn't belong. The lawsuit was filed in federal court, alleging a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment under the precedent set by Rodriguez v. United States. In the Rodriguez case, the Supreme Court ruled that police may not extend an otherwise completed traffic stop, absent reasonable suspicion, in order to conduct a dog sniff, a stop that is prolonged beyond the time reasonably required to complete the mission of issuing a ticket is unlawful. As the case moved toward trial, the initial arrogance of the police department's legal counsel evaporated. They had relied on the expectation that Vance's body cam footage, which he had conveniently muted during his conversation with the handler, would be the only objective record. The introduction of the rental car's synchronized audio and video timeline was a devastating blow to the town's defense. During the depositions, the plaintiff's attorney methodically dismantled Vance's narrative. They forced him to explain exactly what furtive movements he claimed to have seen, contrasting his vague testimony with the steady, calm video footage from inside the cabin. They cornered him on the legal definition of probable cause versus a mere hunch. Under oath, stripping away the protection of the badge and the uniform, Vance's justification sounded hollow, prejudiced, and fundamentally illegal. The federal judge presiding over the case didn't just side with the driver. She issued a scathing summary judgment that bypassed the need for a jury trial on the issue of liability. In her written opinion, the judge meticulously dissected the timeline. She noted that an officer's intuition, while a recognized tool in law enforcement, cannot be a substitute for objective, articulable facts. She wrote that stopping citizens based on an unspoken geographic and demographic gatekeeping is a profound violation of constitutional liberties. The ruling stated that detaining 2 cooperative citizens for nearly an hour to wait for a dog sniff, based on nothing more than the officer's biased disbelief of their perfectly valid professions, was a textbook violation of the Fourth Amendment. The consequences unfolded realistically over the following months. There was no instant, dramatic firing of the officer in a crowded courtroom. Instead, there was the slow, grinding machinery of civil litigation. The township, desperate to avoid the public spectacle and the precedent of a jury awarding punitive damages, settled the civil rights lawsuit for a staggering $450 000 payout. For Officer Vance, the repercussions were significant, though bureaucratic. He was not fired, protected by the dense layers of his union contract, but he was removed from patrol duties. He was reassigned to a desk in the records division, his decades of field experience nullified by his inability to police without prejudice. The internal affairs investigation, forced by the public nature of the federal judge's ruling, placed a permanent mark on his record, severely limiting his pension and freezing his rank. The township's police department was mandated by the settlement terms to undergo rigorous, externally monitored retraining on Fourth Amendment boundaries and implicit bias. For Marcus and David, the payout was never the primary objective. The money went into their firm, funding pro bono community projects back in Chicago. The victory was in the public legal validation of their dignity. It was in the concrete proof that their reality, their lived experience on that dark suburban road, was not an overreaction or a misunderstanding, but an illegal abuse of power. Yet, long after the settlement checks were cashed and the news cycle moved on, the psychological residue remained. Marcus still drove out to client sites. He still wore his tailored suits, but whenever he saw the flash of blue lights in his rearview mirror, even if they were speeding past to another emergency, his jaw would tighten, and his thumb would involuntarily begin rubbing against his index finger. The settlement changed the policy, but it could never erase the profound vulnerability of that night. It forces a quiet, uncomfortable question that lingers long after the story ends. If the very people sworn to protect the public rely on instincts shaped by bias, and if escaping an illegal detention requires an expensive attorney and a high-tech surveillance system to prove your innocence, who exactly is the justice system designed to protect? True justice isn't found in a settlement check after the damage is done. It's found in a society where the right to simply exist in a neighborhood is never treated as a reason for suspicion